If you're on our Flight Insight email list or follow us on social media, you may have seen our most recent Monday morning quiz on instrument approaches. One question about decision altitudes on precision approaches generated some interesting feedback and gives us a chance to address a common misconception. We're on an ILS approach into runway 24 at Palomar in San Diego. An ILS approach, like all precision approaches, comes down to a decision altitude, or DA. This is different than a non-precision approach like the localizer-only version here, which ends in an MDA, minimum descent altitude. Focus on the word minimum. The MDA, as its name implies, is an absolute floor. You can't go below without meeting certain requirements, and many pilots choose to level off with a buffer of 50 or 100 feet or so to prevent accidentally busting it. But does the DA work the same way? Is the decision altitude on this ILS approach, which here is 527 feet, a minimum that we can't go below? For all questions on landing from an instrument approach, we reference 91-175C, operation below DA or MDA. It reads that no pilot may operate an aircraft below the authorized MDA or continue an approach below the authorized DA unless, and then it goes on to list the criteria which allows us to continue the approach to the runway, such as being stabilized, having the required visibility, and having the sufficient runway visual cues. So let's break these stipulations down a bit. First, for the MDA, it says that we can't operate below this altitude without the requirements met. This agrees with the idea of an MDA as a minimum. You can't go below, for example, if you don't have any approach or runway lighting in sight. Now, for the DA, the language is a bit different. It says you can't continue an approach below it without those requirements. Why doesn't it say you can't operate below the DA? Because you actually can, believe it or not. The decision altitude is used as a decision point. It's also our execution point. Unlike a non-precision approach where there's a called out missed approach point like a DME or cross radial, the missed approach point on a precision approach is simply the point on the glide slope when we reach the decision altitude. We've bugged the decision altitude here at 527 feet. When we arrive there, we make our decision. Not before and not after. We look up and we have none of the required visual references, so we decide to go missed. I like to use what's called the 6 C's method of going missed, depending on the aircraft you're flying. We'll click the autopilot off, cram the throttle to takeoff power, climb the aircraft by establishing a pitch attitude, then clean, cool call. But as we're doing this, notice our altitude. While we're making configuration changes in the 6 C's, our momentum carried us below the decision altitude. We never had the required visual references to continue the approach, so did we bust the approach? No, because of the language in 91-175C. We didn't continue the approach below the DA. We executed the missed, the approach was discontinued. If you're still not convinced, have a look at the Airman Certification Standards for the IFR check ride. On the non-precision approach, we have a requirement to maintain an altitude above the MDA plus 100 and minus 0. There's no tolerance for going below the MDA until you're allowed to. But on the precision approach task, that language is completely absent. We need to maintain a stabilized approach down to the DA, and then immediately initiate a missed approach at the DA. Immediately initiate, not go missed and stay above the DA. These differences may seem small, but they get to the key difference between a non-precision and precision approach. And I've heard of plenty of check ride busts that are due to this key misunderstanding of how approaches are flown. The best way I tell my students to remember this is that an MDA is a minimum descent altitude, and a DA is a decision altitude. One has a minimum, the other is a decision point. If you want to make sure there are no gaps in your IFR learning, head on over to our website linked here and in the description. We're having a Black Friday sale that lasts through December 2nd, where everything is 20% off with the code TURKEY20. See you soon.